sound. Hugo, why was divorce a barrier in the king marrying Wallis?
The problem in 1936, when the king wanted to marry Mrs. Simpson, was the fact that he was head of the Church of England, which did not recognise the remarriage of divorced people. And he was aware that at the coronation, he would take the coronation oath, which would have effectively prevented him from marrying Mrs. Simpson, because he would have to swear at the coronation service to uphold the traditions of the Church of England, which, as I say, forbade the remarriage of divorced persons. The fact is, Mrs. Simpson wasn't unsuitable because she was American. She was unsuitable because she had two husbands living. And that's what the British government wouldn't accept. And it's also what the colonial governments wouldn't accept, i.e. the governments of Canada, India, Australia and New Zealand and the various other countries of the empire, all of whom had to be consulted.
Why was she denied the HRH status, though? I mean, they did get married. He was His Royal Highness the Duke of Windsor, but she was, what, Her Grace the Duchess of Windsor?
Well, the whole question of the Duchess's title is a very interesting one, and it's a complex one, because what happened was, of course, the Duke of Windsor had about 7 or 9 different titles in the course of his life. And he had always been His Royal Highness until he became king, and then he was His Majesty King Edward VIII. Upon abdicating, which was a unique situation, hadn't happened before, what was he going to be called? Was he simply Mr. Edward Windsor? Nobody quite knew. And so he was specifically created HRH, the Duke of Windsor, in his own right. But in the creation, at the same time, they denied the Duchess of Windsor the title of Royal Highness. And actually that would have applied to any subsequent Duchess of Windsors that they slightly felt, misunderstanding the character of the king, who might have come along. It was said at the time, we don't want to have a lot of Duchesses of Windsor or a lot of Royal Highness Duchess of Windsor floating around the cafes of Budapest. They actually said that, but they completely misunderstood his devotion to her. They also denied any children that might be born of the marriage. They would not have been Royal Highnesses, and they would not have been in line of succession to the throne. Now, the Duke was very upset about this. 2 things he wanted for his wife. One was he wanted her to be a Royal Highness, and secondly, he wanted her to be received by the King and Queen, and this to be recorded in the Court Circular, which is the official published document of what the court has done, which appears in the Times and the Telegraph. And basically, this was quite convenient from the point of view of the new King and Queen. They just said, well, quite so. They didn't say no, they didn't say anything really, but he said, I won't come back to England unless those things happen. And since they didn't madly want him back in England, they just left it, and he didn't come back.
But how has that changed with Camilla? Because was Camilla a divorcee, and at the same time, isn't she an HRH now?
Yes, I might just add one tiny thing to the other point. The fact that the Duke of Windsor was a member of the royal family and a Royal Highness in his own right, and his wife wasn't, created all sorts of very complicated diplomatic situations for them. And in fact, an edict went out from the new King's private secretary, Sir Alexander Harding, which said to the various legations across Europe and indeed anywhere else, it's perfectly acceptable for you to entertain the Duke and Duchess of Windsor if you wish to, but if you do, the Duchess must always sit on the ambassador's right, which sounds fine until you think about it. Effectively, what it was preventing was anybody being invited, any woman being invited who had status higher than that of an English non-royal duchess. So you wouldn't be able to ask the Windsors to dinner with the president and his wife, who would surely take precedence. You wouldn't be able to invite them to dinner with any other members of any other royal highnesses or kings and queens scattered around Europe. And so it was very, very difficult, and there were all sorts of diplomatic problems that followed from that. Camilla. It's interesting that 1936 you have the Duke of Windsor abdicating and going away in order that he could marry a twice divorced woman, a woman with 2 husbands living. In 1953, and then again in 1955, there arose the problem of Princess Margaret. And Princess Margaret wanted to marry a divorced equerry. She was unmarried herself, and she decided not to. for various reasons, but it was made pretty clear by Anthony Eden, the then Prime Minister, that if she did wish to marry Townsend, she would have to sacrifice her royal title and also her civil list allowance, which was the allowance given for royal duties. It's not payment exactly, but it pays all the expenses. And so, partly for that reason, she decided not to. They made a kind of moral stand. Not that long afterwards, you have this extraordinary situation that Princess Anne, as a divorced princess, wishes to marry an unmarried equerry, and that's perfectly all right. So from 1955 to 1992, that big swing round has happened. And as far as Prince Charles marrying, it was not considered to be a problem that she should become a Royal Highness. That was part of the deal. And of course he wasn't abdicating himself, he was continuing in his role. He is in line of succession to the throne. And so she became Her Royal Highness. Officially, she is the Princess of Wales. She is also the Duchess of Cornwall, and that is the title that she uses. Much more interesting, that, of course, will be what happens when he becomes king. Because it was stated at the time of the marriage, we were all told, she won't be queen, she will be the Princess Consort. But actually, she will be queen, and automatically, because that's how it comes about. If they wish to change that later, that's another matter. But I suspect that they rather hope that by the time it happens, everybody will have accepted her and they'll be perfectly happy for her to be Queen Camilla. We'll have to wait and see on that one.
How does that relate, though, to the law of the Church of England and the Christian Church, though?
Well, it's a very good question how this relates to the Church of England. Because, of course, marriages are now blessed in church, and Prince Charles's marriage to Camilla was blessed in St George's Chapel. They had to marry civilly in the Windsor Guildhall, and then they had a service of blessing in St George's Chapel, attended by the royal family, which looked exactly like a wedding, but it wasn't a wedding. The answer is that the Church of England has relaxed its views about divorced people because there are so many of them, and so many people have this thing, and they wish to in some way give them some sort of comfort. They can't actually marry them in the church, but they can, in this case, bless the marriage. And, of course, the duty of the Prince of Wales is obviously to prepare himself to become king one day. It's also his duty to continue the Protestant succession. And, of course, in the case of Prince Charles, he has done that. He has two boys born of the first marriage with Diana. And if I had been, as it were, spinning the second marriage, which I certainly wasn't, I would have said that, in a sense, the second marriage was never going to produce any more children, no threat of that of any kind at all. And so, in a sense, what he was doing was seeking the comfort of companionship in his middle years, or even as he approaches almost old age. It's a sort of a comfort marriage, if you like, and for companionship. It doesn't involve the succession. So when Prince William becomes king after Prince Charles, there's no sort of Camilla impact, if you like. And perhaps that's also was taken into consideration, I don't know.
Can you describe for us what Wallis's family background truly was? And really, how would it have stood, or how would it stand today with British and American society? Again, of this time and of back then. And, how would she compare to, like, the Bouvier or the Jeromes or the Kellys and so forth?
What is really interesting about Mrs. Simpson, of course, and the things that people have said about her at the time of the abdication, during their lifetime, and even worse, after her death, is that, of course, if you get involved in a big drama like the abdication, the most dreadful things are going to be said about you. And so every possible slur has been attached to her name, including a general impression, I think, that the British public would have had in 1936, and probably even to this day, that she was virtually a prostitute from the corner of the block, as it's known in Baltimore, or, like the street corner, however you like to put it. This, of course, was absolutely untrue, and she and Mrs. Merriman, her aunt, were very upset about it at the time, the kind of description of the family, because the Warfields can trace their ancestry right back to England. In fact, they come from Warfield in Berkshire, not terribly far away from Windsor. They were a very early founding family, and they went over and they were empire builders, and they were one of the key figures, key families in Maryland, in her father, Teagle Wallis Warfield, was the, if you like, the poor relation. He was like rather sad, pathetic, tubercular figure. Unlike his very successful brother, Uncle Sol, he was a very rich man. And the Warfields were a highly respected family. So to the Montagues, it's quite interesting that looking at the Montagues as they go back in history, they too go back to Berkshire, not very far from Warfield. And in fact, one of the Duchess of Windsor's ancestral cousins, if you like, so, kind of there were two second or third cousins, and she descends from one of them. One of those third cousins was a canon of St. George's Chapel and a bishop. And he would have been very surprised at the circumstances of fate which brought the Duchess of Windsor to St. George's Chapel for the Duke's funeral, and indeed in the fullness of time for her own. So they were a highly respectable family, and they've been very much, very badly treated by the media and by a lot of biographers.
Would you say that, give me a comparison of, as we know, the Windsors are from the House of Hanover, essentially, and the comparison of the fact that
yes,
the Windsors, the Hanoverians, and then the Warfields through the Wyatts and the Emerys actually descend from more of a true English root. I don't know if that's fair to say. So you, in other words, created, yes. Make something of that.
Yes. I mean, the British succession to the throne was extremely complicated at a certain point, particularly when James II departed and was considered to have abdicated, and because he had espoused Catholicism, the Act of Settlement was passed. They were determined to have a Protestant king. Very interesting to compare the family from which Edward VIII came and the family that Wallis Warfield came from. In the case of Edward VIII, the Protestant succession was extremely complicated. Because James II had espoused Catholicism, they passed the Act of Settlement. They were determined always to have a Protestant king in Britain thereafter. So a lot of Catholics with a very strong hereditary right were passed over. And that's where you get people like the Old Pretender and the Young Pretender and the King Across the Water and all that. And they decided that it would be the family of Sophia, Electress of Hanover, who would take the English throne. She died just before Queen Anne, so then you get George I, George II, and let's pause for a moment with George III. He has a son who is the Prince Regent, who has a daughter Charlotte, who marries Leopold of Coburg. She is going to have a baby. She and the baby both die. So at that point, the royal family loses 2 generations in one go. George III is mad and locked up in Windsor Castle. The Prince Regent is not going to have any more legitimate children or remarry. So all his brothers, who all have lots of illegitimate children and rather jolly mistresses, have to dump the mistresses and marry German Protestant princesses of childbearing age who are prepared to take on these dissolute figures. And various children are born, and the one that actually eventually becomes queen is Queen Victoria, the daughter of the Duke of Kent. So in a way she was almost a designer baby. And she, of course, proved to be one of the most remarkable queens in the history of the monarchy. And from her descends Edward VII, George V, and we get to Edward VIII. On Wallis Warfield's side, her family, you can trace back to founder Knights of the Garter, the Earl of Devon, back to Edward I and the Plantagenets, and really as far as you like. Now, the Edward VIII did descend from them too, of course. But it's very interesting to find her descending from them through the Wyatts and various other links. I mean, a lot of people did, a lot of people do, but she certainly did. And it's great fun to find her descended from the second Earl of Devon, because he was a founder Knight of the Garter created by Edward III, with a stall in St. George's Chapel, where, as I say, she attended the funeral of her husband, and then later her own funeral was held.
did Wallis want to be queen? And would she have kept him from abdicating?
The whole question of the abdication is, of course, again, one of the most fascinating things, because on the whole, men do not give up things for women. And he gave up ruling over 2/3 of the world's population in order to marry this lady with 2 husbands living, who wasn't particularly good looking, wasn't particularly intelligent as far as we know, although she was a perfectly nice, very nice person who was very much liked by her friends. One of the most interesting things that I discovered when doing the book I did about them was that the world adored the Prince of Wales. They thought he was wonderful. People who knew him had distinct reservations. The world hated Mrs. Simpson, but people who knew Mrs. Simpson, on the whole, really rather liked her. Did she want to be queen? No, she did not. What happened, I think, was that of course she was excited when she came with Mr. Simpson to live in London, to be drawn into the Prince of Wales' set through her friendship with Thelma, Lady Furness. And she flirted with him without quite understanding who he was, as if he was a film star or a tycoon. In so doing, she captured a damaged man, a man who was fundamentally longing to escape. He did not want to be king. He was fed up, he was exhausted, he was worn out, he was washed out. And he, of course, in a sense, I don't think he would have admitted this if questioned himself, but in a sense he used her as a means of escape. And so she got tangled up in a situation which got out of hand, and certainly out of her control. And unfortunately what happened at the time of the abdication was that people threw stones through her window, so she took fright and she left. Everybody agreed it was much safer. She should go off to France with Lord Brownlow and stay with her friends in the south of France. Before that, she had had a very strong control of the king. She got him to stop drinking, she got him much more interested in his life, and he very much depended on her. She had gone, so she wasn't there to influence him at this point. In those few weeks of her absence, independent of her, he took the decision to abdicate, and frankly she never forgave him. She was absolutely horrified. There is a story from Lord Brownlow of her cowering under a rug as she hears the news of the abdication. This must not happen. What could she do after that? She had to marry him. She had to become the woman that the world hated, the woman who stole the king, and go into exile with him. It was her duty from that moment onwards to look after a man who every day of his life had been thoroughly occupied, and after this point had absolutely nothing to do at all. And frankly she made a very good job of it, but it can't have been easy.
The impact of the abdication, them leaving England, and then of course making way for George and Elizabeth, those lines. Discuss how really in a way Wallis, the whole situation really worked out for the better.
In London, in Trafalgar Square, there are various statues, and for a long time there's been a very controversial empty plinth. And there have been various suggestions as to people who should be put onto this plinth. And some people have suggested that actually Mrs. Simpson should be placed on this plinth for having taken the king away, because he was a difficult, tempestuous, mercurial, charming but bad-tempered figure. He was a mixture of the good and the bad in a very fascinating way. And actually the British nation was so much better off with his brother George VI, who came to the throne unprepared for it, but determined to do his duty and be a good constitutional monarch. He had the one good fortune, very much recognised by Edward VIII, that he had a very strong wife to support him and look after him. And I would go so far as to say that her strength and power, that of Queen Elizabeth, later the Queen Mother, her strength and power made it possible for George VI to be a good constitutional monarch, and she gave him the credit for it. She let him take the credit. He died probably earlier than he should have done, partly of course because he got cancer and he smoked too much, but that could have been partly through the stress of the job. And he died at the age of 56 in February 1952, which paved the way for his daughter, who has proved to be again one of the great queens of England and has again, just recently, achieved 60 years on the throne. This year, 2012, she celebrates her Diamond Jubilee, and she has been the most remarkable stabilising force in Britain, a force of continuity, and somebody who is very wise and very calm. And it's always said that she has a number of advisors, but people who know her say the advisors frequently come to her for advice, because when she came to the throne, her first Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, was a man born in 1874 who had served in Queen Victoria's army, had been a member of Parliament in the reigns of all subsequent kings, and close advisor, of course, to George VI during the war, whereas her present Prime Minister, David Cameron, was born in 1964 and is the age of the Queen's youngest son. In fact, I think he was in a pantomime with Prince Edward at Heatherdown School. I think he played a rabbit.
Let's talk about Wallis being really sort of a first sort of fashion icon, and pairing that with how really both the Duke and Duchess were the first members of the royal family to be maybe intimate with the public, that kind of thing, if you could blend those all together. And talk about, you know, the various fashion designers she dealt with, and just sort of,
Yes.
sort of almost being, paving the way for a Diana.
Yes.
I'm sure Diana did all this on her own, but trying to link it that,
Sure.
you know.
I just remembered though, I've also, maybe I should just say that thing about the Kelly family. And
Yes,
I
yes,
didn't.
yes,
Um,
pick that up, please.
Yes. Looking at who Mrs. Simpson was as a person marrying into the royal family, marrying a royal duke, Alistair Forbes certainly thought that her ancestry was probably rather better than that of the young Duchess of Kent and the young Duchess of Gloucester, two royal duchesses who married in the 60s and 70s into the family, and probably also of a higher class, if you like, than the Jeromes who produced Lady Randolph Churchill, the Kellys who produced Princess Grace of Monaco, and the Bouviers who produced Jackie Kennedy. I think it would be fair to say that the Warfields were a better respected family than any of those three, which doesn't mean that they weren't respected too, but certainly she was from a better family, which is quite interesting, really. As far as fashion is concerned, I suppose that it could be said that after the abdication, her duty was to keep the Duke happy, to feed him, as she did, delicious food in much more beautiful surroundings in the second half of his life than ever he had in the first half, and also to be an adornment to him. And actually, I've often thought, and I know Lady Diana Cooper, who was knew them both pretty well, she said that if she'd married the Duke, she would have taken him off to Virginia and let him be a cowboy, do something totally different. Perhaps it was a mistake, quite an interesting one and a certainly understandable one, that Mrs. Simpson actually did her best to become a kind of royal duchess. And actually, as time went on, she looked better than most of the royal duchesses. And she dressed beautifully, and she acquired her own very particular style of dressing. She also had her own very, very particular jewellery with all the various brooches and rings and necklaces and all those sort of things. And I think also because of the position that they found themselves in, they were prepared to give interviews to people like Ed Murrow and later on to Kenneth Harris in England, and to appear, as he did in his film The King's Story, to, as it were, relate to the media in every sense of the word, if you like, and give interviews and answer questions. And there's plenty of footage of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor talking about their lives or their garden or how they run the house or all that sort of thing, which the royal family at that point certainly
It is rolling.
the royal family, some of them do give interviews now, but certainly they didn't in the past. You will find no interviews with the Queen Mother, certainly none with George VI or any of that generation. They absolutely didn't do it. But the Windsors, because they were to some extent cast adrift and because they were here in the United States, they did give interviews. They talked to Ed Murrow. He appeared in his film The King's Story. They were very keen to put their point of view across to the media. So in that sense also they were trendsetters and they were ahead of their time. And I suppose that the style of Mrs. Simpson as Duchess of Windsor, actually, fun enough, very much was mentioned at the time of the recent royal wedding, that they said that some of Kate Middleton's outfits were inspired by the Duchess of Windsor. And she has, in every sense, in the last year or two, come very much into the forefront of people's minds. And so she has become, again, a kind of style icon and a person whose position and plight and place in history and whose motives and things have all been re-examined. And on the whole, I think she's coming out a bit better these days than she did beforehand.
Can you mention, discuss, well, I'll tell you what would be interesting to find out is, you said that if she had been around, he would not have abdicated.
Oh yes, yeah.
If he did not abdicate, how would she have turned out in all of this? Or how do you think it all would have turned out? Related to not so much, eventually I guess the Queen would become the Queen in 1972 when he died.
Yeah.
But what do you think, how do you
Yes.
think Wallis, what was Wallis wanting to have happen?
The question should really be asked is, what would have happened if she hadn't gone to France and if she'd stayed around and had managed to persuade him not to abdicate, which she might well have succeeded in doing. She always thought that he was a man who'd known to have had several mistresses and girlfriends in the past, and that her star would wane, and at a certain point she'd probably go back to nice dull Mr. Simpson with a few jewels to her credit. I think Mr. Simpson wasn't so convinced that that was likely to happen, but it's interesting to think that she never thought that it would go much further. Had he stayed as king, some people suggest that he might have got away with marrying her at a later date. I'm not so sure that he could have done on account of the coronation oath and various other things. I think that they put forward a pretty strong case against this marriage. But it might have been that if he had established himself as king for a few more years, perhaps quietly married her, as some other kings in history have done, particularly abroad, he might have got away with it. But this is one of the big ifs of history. I think probably that it all turned out for the best, except maybe for the Windsors themselves. I'm not sure whether the life that they later on led will have made them particularly happy. I think that it's good advice to give any young people that if you have to make the choice between duty and happiness, choose duty, because it'll always make you much happier in the long run. And they did the opposite.
Mention the burial problem and the possibility of being married. Of being buried in Baltimore.
Yes.
And where are they going to do?
That's
Will
right.
they just go up?
It comes on and off.
Okay.
It's to stop you falling over when you go to the loo in the night.
Okay. Oh, I see. I thought that was it. So the
Yes, the burial question.
yes.
Of course, the kings and queens of England have traditionally been buried at Westminster Abbey and various other places. And since George III built the Royal Vault in St George's Chapel, St George's Chapel, Windsor, has by and large been the place where the kings and queens of England are buried. There are 11 kings in St George's Chapel, including King George V of Hanover, who was a cousin of Queen Victoria's. Queen Victoria herself built a mausoleum at Frogmore, which is in the grounds of the castle, if you like, the home park. Edward VIII did not know where, the Duke of Windsor didn't know where he was going to be buried. He contemplated being buried in France. I think I'm right in saying that James II is buried in France, and I think he thought for a time that he might be buried there. But he also decided at one point to buy a plot in Baltimore in Greenmount Cemetery, and he got his friend Clarence Miles to investigate this and to purchase this plot, and that was going to be another alternative. Actually, as early as 1961, it was decided that he would be buried at Frogmore, where since 1928 there's been a private royal family burial ground, which is where his brother, the Duke of Kent, was buried, and he actually in 1968 attended the burial of Princess Marina, and this very much crystallized his wish to be buried there. But of course there was one very important stipulation, which was that the Duchess of Windsor should be buried with him at his side. The Queen agreed that, and so eventually they dropped the Green Mount Cemetery idea. It may possibly have been that in negotiating where he was going to be buried,
Hugo, can you really discuss a lot of the false accusations that have been made about the Duchess and what the motivation would have been? Could you name some of the more, unfortunately, some of the more
outrageous.
well-known or outrageous accusations?
The trouble is, if you get involved in the abdication, and as far as I'm concerned, she was a victim of the abdication, but nevertheless the world considered her to be the woman who stole the king, you're going to have every possible thing thrown at you. Fortunately, I suppose most of them have been thrown at her by unscrupulous biographers after her death, but she has been accused of possibly being a man, which is total rubbish, as anyone who looked after her, nursed her, could have told and could have squashed that immediately. They say she was a Nazi sympathizer. I don't think that's the case either. They say that she was a mistress of Ribbentrop, and I don't know, lots of other people. Again, all nonsense. There's just nothing that they won't throw at the Duchess of Windsor to try to make her seem disreputable, and they did it. Lots of people did it at the time. I mean, they were trying to blacken her name, and even quite serious and sensible civil servants working for the British government were coming out with these things. They suggested there was a China dossier which that she'd learnt all sorts of absurd sexual practices to capture the king in Shanghai when she was out there and so forth. There's not a shred of evidence to support any of these things, but they will always stick because mud sticks, and mud sticks on a person who got involved in a big crisis, in a big drama like the abdication. So it's very easy for the mud to stick. So it's a pity, and unfortunately, it is a sign of the times too that people who get interested in these sort of figures like the Duchess of Windsor, on the whole, they kind of want dirt. They kind of don't perhaps even really care whether it's true or not. It makes a better story, which I think is a great shame, because I think the true story is extremely interesting, and endless discussion can be had as to what were her motives with the king, what were his motives towards her. I'm fairly certain that I'm right in saying that he wanted to go, he didn't want to be king, that she was fascinated by him and obviously deeply flattered by the whole thing, and then would have liked to escape. I think that's pretty much what happened. After that, of course, it must have been very difficult for her, and he, of course, remained totally obsessed and devoted to her till his dying day. I mean, her Swiss secretary told me that, wasn't it wonderful when the Duke, the Duchess was going to the hairdresser, that she'd come down the stairs and the Duke would come down the lift to see her into the car, off she'd go. When she came back, there he'd be on the front doorstep waiting to greet the car and escort her back into the house. And I thought to myself, well, in theory it's wonderful, but in practice it's actually ghastly. I mean, if you want a spaniel, buy one, don't marry one. To have somebody following you around, and apparently, he was always insecure and always thinking she was going to leave him and sort of dreading something awful was going to happen. I mean, it would have been terrible if she died before him from his point of view, although it was equally terrible what happened to her later on by outliving him by 14 years.
Could you mention, off the top of your head, any famous quotes from Wallis that are...
Well, Mrs. Simpson always was very funny and sharp and full of wisecracks, and I remember Lady Diana Cooper saying that the room sharpened up when she came in. She brought the best out of people. And I think it was she just had that natural sense of humour, that she always kind of thought of the right thing to say to cap a story or whatever. The famous lines, of course, about you can never be too rich or too thin. is well known. I rather like the story that she said when she was quite old and she was having dinner in Paris, and she said, people are always telling me I should look up my old friends. Look 'em up, dig 'em up.
Very good.
Very good.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And,
One moment, I'm sorry. Is there any other points that you wanted to bring up personally?
Well, not particularly, unless I maybe could just make a general point about what I was trying to do on her behalf, if you like.
Yes, I would like that very much. If you
Is that-
don't mind, please.
Possibility.
What I will do, if I can, you know how I can put it in the script and so forth, we will have visuals of your books related
Yeah,
about the
lovely.
Duke and Duchess.
Yes,
The-
yes.
Both the private world and
Yes,
the tragic untold story.
yes.
Absolutely.
So should I just say something about that?
Yes, just waiting for the camera to come back on.
Okay.
okay, I'm ready when you are.
I was very lucky to go over to the Duke of Windsor's house in 1972, shortly before he died, to see his private secretary, and somehow got tangled up in this story and got fascinated by both of them. I was already very, very interested. I'd read their memoirs and so forth. But very soon after that, the Duke died, and then the Duchess fell ill, and nobody quite knew what was going on. The awful Metro Bloom sort of moved in and took control. And I kind of lived through all those years, talking to the private secretaries and hearing various conflicting stories about what was really happening and so forth. And then, some years later, the Duchess's personal secretary, who's a Swiss girl, a little bit older than me, she said to me, really, you should write this story and I will help you. And the main story I was writing was about what happened to the Duchess after the Duke died, when she fell into the hands of her lawyer. But also to have another look at who was the Duchess, and what was she really like, and what was she up to? Was she really the woman who stole the king? Was she a victim, or was she a villain? And I think in the end she was a victim. And it's been very interesting in these last months, since the book came out in London last April 2011, going around and talking about her to audiences who you would think on the whole would be quite unsympathetic and had certainly been brought up to dislike the whole idea of her. They have begun to consider her in a different light, which has been very pleasing, and I think is fair and correct. I think if you're looking for a villain, unfortunately it's him, not her.
Okay. And there's just one thing. Did you have him introduce himself? Just to speak it out, just in case we need it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, I'm Hugo Vickers, and I'm a royal historian and biographer, and I've been interested in the British royal family since I was a child. Luckily harnessed that interest into something a little bit more interesting than if it was a kind of stamp collecting, train spotter kind of interest. And I became terribly interested in the Windsors, particularly because I'm always fascinated by people who are a little bit sidelined by life, and she certainly was that.
Very good.
And then I'd like a close-up, if we could have a pan out, or close-up on the pen, and then...
Okay.
So,
We don't need audio.
Okay, no. Do you mind that? Do you like...
No, that's fine.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.